If you find you can't be bullish on Bitcoin anymore because the price is more mid than your average influencer, then I got some good news for you. Last week, one of the most famous hedge fund managers in the world, best known for his predictions on the future of the economy, revealed to the world where we're at in this movie called Recent Times. And as you know, it's not pretty. Distrust and disdain towards governments, institutions, and authority is at an all-time high, and they've never been more desperate for power. Today, I'm going to walk you through how this billion-dollar hedge fund manager is signaling the end of the world order, a foreshadowing of the collapse of the dollar from 2023, and a real-life admission from the IMF on how they plan to steal your savings and make you poor. Welcome back to Satoshi. Let's break down the collapse of everything we know. Hey everyone, I'm back from maternity leave, and apparently I leave for 5 minutes to create a literal life, and the global financial system decides to speedrun the collapse of the world order.
The whole financial system?
Cool, totally fine. Totally stable. Today, we're going to break down why a $15.4 trillion hedge fund manager just revealed why you should be still bullish on Bitcoin, even if the price feels sleepy. And I promise you, that's not how my newborn feels. That girl is not sleepy at all. But I promise you that by the end of this, you're going to see what he sees.
Are we, in your judgment, in a moment in which the world order is going to change?
Yes, we're changing the world order. Okay. In 1945, we started the new world order. What I mean is, throughout history, there's a fight for control because there's no world court that you go to and plead your case. And so there's a fight for power. So there's a war, and then the winners come out of that war, and the winners set the rules. And so 1945, the United States had 80% of the world's money. Gold was money at the time. It had half the world's GDP. It had a monopoly on military power. So the U.S. set the world order. That's why the United Nations is in New York. Washington, D.C. has the IMF and the World Bank.
And its currency became the reserve currency.
And its currency became the reserve currency because of that set of circumstances. Okay, things evolve. Things change. Okay, over history. So the three big things that are changing now, that haven't occurred in our lifetime, is the amount of debt and money creation, which affects the value of money, and you can see it affecting what's going on every day.
Large debt means the printing of money.
Right. The large debt puts central bankers in a choice. Do you pay it back with hard money, or do you pay it back with printed devalued money? And if you pay it back with hard money, it's hard. In other words, that's when you have debt crises. So in all cases, they eventually print money, and that produces inflation, right? So that dynamics, the first...
And that's the place we are at this moment.
That's the place we are at this moment. Okay.
Let's start with the man himself, Ray Dalio, founder of Bridgewater Associates, which oversees roughly $15.4 trillion in institutional capital influence globally. Dalio has been screaming for years about what he calls changing world order. But recently, his tone shifted. He's not just talking about cycles anymore. He's talking about systemic fracture, debt at unsustainable levels, internal political division, external geopolitical conflict, reserve currency risk. He literally laid out the playbook for how empires fall and then calmly pointed out that the US is checking most of these boxes. Massive debt? Check. Money printing? Check. Wealth gaps? Check. Global rivals forming alternate trade systems? Check. When a $15.4 trillion hedge fund manager reveals that we are in the late stages of debt cycle and a breakdown of world order, you should probably pay attention.
How are we going to solve this problem?
We're going to do it the way that we always do it, and it's always done when countries essentially go broke. What they do is they, through a combination of devaluing the currency, printing of money. And there's an imbalance. They print money, devalue the currency, and create an artificially low interest rate so that the person who's holding the bonds is receiving an artificially low interest rate. That's the way Japan has done it with their local, and that's the way we will do it.
So in other words, my grandchildren and great-grandchildren not yet born are going to be paying off this debt in devalued dollars. More or less.
It's going to happen faster than that.
Because here's what he's really signaling without saying it outright. The stability premium of the US dollar is ending. And when trust in institutions collapses, capital looks for neutrality. And guess what's neutral? Bitcoin is neutral. Dalio won't max say it on stage, but the subtext is screaming.
Today, Brazil, in our hemisphere, largest country in the Western Hemisphere south of us, cut a trade deal with China. They're going to, from now on, do trade in their own currencies, get right around the dollar. They're creating a secondary economy in the world, totally independent of the United States. We won't have to talk about sanctions in 5 years because there'll be so many countries transacting in currencies other than the dollar that we won't have the ability to sanction them.
Now let's layer in geopolitics, shall we? Recently, we've seen rhetoric from figures like Marco Rubio, who Venezuelans are calling Papi Rubio, about why the U.S. is engaging more aggressively in regions like Venezuela and Iran. The message: if we can't sanction them effectively anymore, we escalate leverage. So, translation, sanctions used to work because the dollar system was unavoidable, but now it's a little bit of a different story. Before this, global trade cleared in dollars, energy markets cleared in dollars, SWIFT cleared in dollars. But what happens when countries start trading outside of the dollar? When Venezuela, Iran, Russia, China begin forming bilateral systems that are based on a currency everyone in the world has access to. This isn't just BRICS, but something that everybody has access to. Sanctions start to lose teeth. And when financial control weakens, empires historically shift from financial dominance to physical dominance.
The rise of a great power to challenge the existing great power. In other words, I gave you the example of how the United States was so dominant in 1945. Now it's not as dominant. It is not dominant. In other words, China and the opposition is as strong as the United States and its allies. And so we have a conflict. And there are 5 kinds of wars. And they start in this order, just sequentially, typically. A trade war, a technology war, a geopolitical influence war. Then you get into a capital and economic warfare, which we are now with sanctions. They always happened in history. And then there's a military war. And so you could see that progression happen through time. And that creates a template. So I like to look at the template and then plot dots to see how we're transpiring relative to that template.
And that's not bullish for stability or world peace, but it is bullish for capital flight. And capital flight historically runs to 3 things: gold, hard assets, and now Bitcoin. Because Bitcoin doesn't care who you sanction, it doesn't care what country you're in, it doesn't require permission, it settles in 10 minutes. So when global powers start admitting sanctions are losing power, that's not a weakness for Bitcoin so much as it is a validation.
Well, look, the United States took a pretty drastic action in terms of the sanctions, that they went after individuals, country, and also took some of the Russian assets and said, hey, we're going to give it to the Ukrainian people. When that happened, Bitcoiners came out and they said, you are actually going to further accelerate the demise of the U.S. dollar because now you have introduced this sanctions risk. There was a paper that came out of the Harvard Economics Department where they talked about, will countries now start to buy Bitcoin, not for price, not for the sovereignty, but actually as a sanctions hedge?
Russia.
And so Russia is actually doing that.
Yes.
Do you think they're the only one?
No.
I wouldn't bet on it.
So before we go any further, let's get a quick gut check.
Message.
Check your setup. If you're not running a node, you're not verifying your own transactions, and you're relying on someone else. The Bitcoin way will get your coins off the exchange into cold storage and guide you step by step in setting up your own node. This isn't theory, it's hands-on training from the masters of self-custody. And if we're entering a new world order, you better be sovereign in this one. So visit thebitcoinway.com/Satoshi to book your consultation. That's thebitcoinway.com/SATOSHE.
We actually have a beautiful opportunity in front of us with the United States being such an unmitigated disaster as it currently is. Okay? So there is the opportunity, and within that opportunity, I would suggest 3 things. The first one, we have to have a global asset registry. We have to know who has the freaking money. And if they don't want you to know that they have the money or how much money they have, chances are they got it from somewhere they shouldn't have gotten it from, and they're spending it on something they shouldn't be spending it on. Number 2, we have to facilitate an international conversation about what is enough. And that if there is a number that is enough, there is a number that is too much. We believe that money becomes power, and when power threatens your democracy, you have to take away power, and the only way to take away that power is by taking away the money. And the only way to take away the money is taxation. So number 3, forget progressivity, all right? Forget progressivity, unless by progressivity you mean taxation that makes people less rich. This is not about a 2% wealth tax when somebody's getting a higher return than that. This is about taxation in order to preserve human freedom.
So let's talk about the big players, the IMF and the World Bank. Institutions designed to stabilize global finance are now openly discussing capital controls, CBDCs, liquidity injections, and coordinated debt restructuring. Translation: they're desperate. Because global debt levels are mathematically unserviceable without printing, devaluation, or confiscation via inflation. And when you hear IMF officials float ideas like coordinated global liquidity mechanisms or digital monetary tools, that's code for programmable money. Money with rules, money with expiration dates, money that can be frozen. Meanwhile, Bitcoin just keeps producing blocks, tick-tock next block. No meetings, no emergency sessions, no policy committees. The IMF requires compliance, but Bitcoin only requires math. And that's why they fear it, because Bitcoin is the only opt-out button that actually scales globally.
My view of the promise of Bitcoin, though, is deeper than that. It is an opt-out from the broken financial architecture created by the U.S. Federal Reserve System. And I say this as somebody who wants to fight for, if I'm the U.S. president, I want to fight for the dollar to remain the reserve currency of the world. But there's a funny thing that happens. There's two ways of doing that. One is if you're really insecure about your own value proposition, you try to smash out the competition. Well, the fact that the government officials are coming for alternative forms of currency the way they are, Bitcoin included, reflects an insecurity in their own value proposition. I look at it the other way. I think the existence of Bitcoin holds the dollar's feet to the fire to make sure that it can't be manipulated in a way that people don't just opt out and go the other direction. Because if they do have that opt out, that's what actually keeps us on our own toes. And so I love the idea, the alluring vision, and is why I was first drawn to it, certainly, of a total opt out. Code is law, a Wild West jungle that completely opts out of the Byzantine government-captured, government-orchestrated corruption in the existing system. And I think that remains the promise as long as the proponents of it are willing to stick to that vision, as I do. And so we can get into a deeper conversation there, but the original promise was an opt-out, a backstop, an actual competitive outlet to say that if the existing architecture itself, the rails are broken, we're going to build new rails with a fixed supply. So nobody can print more artificial snow like the current Federal Reserve does. No skiing artificial snow. You're skiing on a fixed supply of the real thing. Great. I think it's a beautiful system.
Now, here's the part that most people miss. In a reality where world order is fracturing, sanctions are losing effectiveness, institutions are desperate, debt is unpayable, stability becomes the most valuable asset in existence. Bitcoin's monetary policy hasn't changed in 15 years. No surprise rate cuts, no emergency stimulus, no temporary money printing. It is the only major monetary system on Earth that is predictable, neutral, borderless, fixed. And when a $15.4 trillion hedge fund manager reveals that the current system is breaking, he's not telling you to panic. He's telling you the old pillars are cracking, and maybe you should panic. Bitcoin is emerging as a new one, not because it's trendy, not because influencers like it, not because you're seeing me talk about it, but because in a world addicted to manipulation, Bitcoin is uncorruptible.
I was going to say one thing in particular that struck me and that I'm worried about is this idea of some sort of Federal Reserve currency banked coin, which if you Google me, you will know I'm not the biggest fan of the Federal Reserve. And I definitely don't think that they should be driving either our technology or our policy or our massive trade balance. But for me, just really quickly, so I was taking an Uber yesterday, and it just so happened that the guy that was driving my vehicle, he's Venezuelan, or he was Venezuelan. And so we started talking about the concept of Bitcoin and that kind of stuff. And I think I've told you before that I have family. Most of my family is actually in Venezuela. And so I was like, hey, well, what do you think? I mean, he lives, and his family lives in a country where they have inflation of 1,000 or 1,000,000%, where they have a government, a tyrannical dictatorship, where they're not allowed to purchase things without permission. And for him, and this is exactly what he told me, he goes, all I use is Bitcoin. For him, and he used this word, it's incorruptible. The idea that he can go and make sure that that transaction is solid or safe, it's in his account, that is manageable. And I think ultimately for our next session coming up, we want to make sure that that still remains an incorruptible way of thinking.
And that's why you should still be bullish on Bitcoin. Not because of the chart, but because it's simply math. Maybe that should be like an alt name for this channel, Simply Math. And speaking of sovereignty, you can't talk about the future of global money without talking about mining. Because miners don't just secure the network, they secure the revolution. If you want to understand where this industry is heading, and if you want to be in the room where real signal is happening, you need to be at Mining Disrupt. The biggest Bitcoin mining event of the year is taking over Miami, Florida, July 21st to the 23rd. And this might be the most important mining event in history. The biggest names in the industry, cutting-edge rigs, Bitcoin and AI integration, the signal that you won't get anywhere else. So grab your tickets today and use promo code SimplyBitcoin for 20% off. We'll see you there. Look, I just came back from maternity leave. Creating life teaches you something real quick, and this is my second time around. You start to think long term. You start thinking about stability. You start thinking about the world that your kids are inheriting. And when I took a look at the $34 trillion US debt, when I look at global conflicts and hear hedge fund legends talk about the breakdown of the world order, I don't get scared. I get validated and more convinced every day because Bitcoin was built for this exact moment. So if you're feeling mid about price action, zoom out. This isn't about this week. This is about the monetary reset of our lifetime. So drop a comment below. Do you think that we're in the final phase of the dollar system? Let me know. And as always, stack, slay, and stay bullish, baby.